August 1945, on a Guam airfield, this Japanese POW expected chains. Corporal Nakamura Kenji braced for the blow. His training had promised him only shame. Instead, an American sergeant offered him a wooden guitar. He was now POW number 2738, a number in a system he didn't understand. The music he played for his captors felt like a strange kind of freedom. But that act of mercy came with a price he would not discover until he returned home. When your enemy hands you a guitar instead of chains, who is truly holding you captive? Tell us where you're listening from and the exact time there. We want to see how far these testimonies travel. If mercy and memory matter to you, subscribe to keep them alive. For Corporal Nakamura Kenji, the humid air of the Guam airfield was a thick blanket, smelling of aviation fuel and rain. The year was 1945. The war was over for him, but the fear was not. It was a dry, metallic taste in his mouth, a tightening in his stomach that had been there for weeks. Around him, the other captured soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army shuffled in a ragged line down the steel ramp of a transport plane. Their boots scraped on the metal, a tired, rhythmic sound against the thud of canvas duffel bags being thrown onto a truck. Nakamura, just 23 years old, kept his eyes down. He had been a radio operator, trained to listen for signals in the static, but now he listened only for the rattle of chains. Propaganda had been the clearest signal of all, broadcast for years across the empire. Capture meant starvation. It meant beatings. It meant an unbearable shame that was far worse than a clean death on the battlefield. He had seen his comrades choose that death. He had not. Now, he braced himself for the consequences of his survival, his shoulders tensed for the hard grip of a guard, his wrists ready for the cold bite of iron shackles. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see an American sergeant, a tall man whose face was unreadable. But the man was not holding chains. In his hands, he held a wooden guitar, its body warm and brown under the harsh Pacific Sunday. Nakamura stood frozen. The sergeant stepped forward and extended the instrument. The gesture was not rough, but it was not a question either. It was an offering that felt like a command. Nakamura's hands, trained to tap out Morse code and sight a rifle, rose numbly to accept it. The weight was familiar and yet alien. The wood was smooth, polished by other hands. 6 steel strings were stretched taut across the sound hole, ready to make a noise other than the drone of engines or the crack of gunfire. This was an American guitar, its shape slightly different from the instruments he had seen back home. But music was a universal language, and this offering made no sense. He thought of his childhood in Osaka, of the gentle, 3-stringed notes of the shamisen his grandmother played in the evenings. He had learned the chords from her, his small fingers finding their place on the fretboard. He had not touched an instrument since his induction into the army in 1943. Music belonged to a world of peace, a world of evenings at home, a world that no longer existed. He looked from the guitar to the American's face, searching for a sign of mockery, a hint of the cruelty he had been promised. The sergeant simply nodded at the guitar, and through the humid air, Nakamura understood the unspoken words. Play something. It was the most baffling order he had ever received. The journey from Guam to the mainland United States was a disorienting blur of sea and sky. Nakamura kept the guitar close, a strange and silent companion. The other prisoners regarded it with suspicion, as if it were a trick. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes reflecting the same deep uncertainty Nakamura felt. They were all ghosts, men who were supposed to be dead, now being transported to the heart of the enemy's homeland. No one was beaten. The food was plain but plentiful. The guards watched them with a kind of weary detachment, not the rabid hatred they had been warned about. They landed not in a desert wasteland, but in California, and were put on a train that clicked and swayed for days across a country of impossible size. They traveled north, into the green heart of America, to a place called Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. Here, the air was cool and clean, and the trees were different, their leaves turning shades of gold and red under the autumn Sunday. At the camp, they were processed not with blows, but with paperwork. They were handed new clothes, simple work uniforms with the letters PW stenciled on the back. They were assigned to long wooden barracks lined with neatly spaced cots, each with its own blanket. They were given a daily calorie ration of nearly 3,000, a level of sustenance unimaginable in war-torn Japan, where civilians were slowly starving. This was all done according to rules set down by a distant authority, the Office of the Provost Marshal General, an entity that followed a document signed in 1900 929 inches, a city called Geneva. These rules were a world away from the code of honor Nakamura had been taught. That code, repeated in training manuals and patriotic songs, insisted that a true Japanese soldier never surrendered. To be captured was to erase one's own existence. Back in Japan, the government refused to accept Red Cross parcels for its captured soldiers, because to acknowledge their existence was to acknowledge their failure. By the war's end, over 21,000 Japanese soldiers would be held in American camps like this one. They were the lucky ones. Hundreds of thousands of their comrades who surrendered to the Soviets would be sent to the frozen labor camps of Siberia, where mercy was a myth. But here, in the middle of America, the myth was the one Nakamura had been told his entire life, the one about the cruel, barbaric enemy. Here, the rules were clear, and the rules included cots and food and even a recreation hut with books and chessboards. And for prisoner number 2738, the rules included a guitar. In the quiet of the barracks, surrounded by the soft snores of other sleeping men, Nakamura held the instrument in the dark. He did not play, not yet. He simply sat with the impossible object, running his fingers over the silent strings, and asked himself the same question over and over. Why? Why would an enemy who had bombed his home and defeated his nation give him music? The guitar sat in the corner of the barracks for 2 weeks, a silent piece of polished wood and steel. Nakamura, now known as Prisoner No. 2738, performed his daily duties with the same quiet discipline he had shown in the army. He swept the floors, helped in the kitchens, and stood for roll call. He observed the other men, both the Japanese who shared his shame and the Germans from the European war who carried themselves with a different kind of defiance. They were all cogs in the well-oiled machine of Camp McCoy, a place that ran on schedules and regulations, not rage. There was a recreation hut, a long wooden building that smelled of pine and soap. Inside, men played chess, read worn books, or wrote letters on thin paper that would be censored before being sent. It was here, on a cool afternoon in late autumn, that Nakamura finally picked up the guitar. He felt the eyes of the other prisoners on him, a mixture of curiosity and distrust. A German officer paused his game of cards. A Japanese private stopped writing a letter home. The room grew quiet, the only sounds the rustle of turning pages and the distant shout of a guard outside. He sat on a simple wooden stool, the guitar resting on his knee. His fingers, stiff from disuse, felt clumsy on the frets. He did not know any American songs. His mind was a blank slate, emptied by war and shock. Then, a memory surfaced, soft and distant. It was a melody from his childhood, a lullaby his mother used to hum as she worked in their small Osaka home. The first note was quiet, hesitant. It hung in the air, fragile but clear. He played another, and then another, the simple tune unfolding in the silent hut. It was a song of peace, of paper lanterns and quiet streets, of a world that felt 1,000,000 miles and a lifetime away. The Japanese prisoners straightened their backs, their faces softening with a recognition that went deeper than words. The Germans watched, their expressions unreadable, but their attention fixed. Even the American guards standing by the door, young men not much older than Nakamura, turned to listen. The music was not Japanese or American. It was just a melody, filled with a sadness and a longing that everyone in that room, captor and captive, could understand. For a few minutes, there were no enemies, only men listening to a song about home. This small act of mercy, a guitar, a moment to play, was part of a deliberate policy. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention, an international agreement that laid out rules for the humane treatment of prisoners of war. These rules dictated the food they ate, the shelters they lived in, and their right to recreation. It was a code of conduct that stood in stark contrast to the one Nakamura had been taught. Japanese military propaganda had spent years building a myth that capture was a fate worse than death, and that the Allies were monsters who would inflict unspeakable tortures. This myth was so powerful that the Japanese government actively worked to erase its captured soldiers from existence, even refusing to deliver Red Cross parcels because accepting them would be an admission of their capture and, therefore, their dishonor. Of the more than 60,000 Japanese soldiers captured by the Soviet Union near the end of the war, tens of thousands would perish from starvation, disease, and brutal labor in Siberian camps. In America, the story was different. Here, the system was designed not to break men, but to hold them until the war was over. One of the guards who often listened was a sergeant from the 32nd Infantry Division named William Harlan. He was a quiet man from the Midwest who had fought through the mud and blood of the New Guinea campaign, a place where mercy was a fatal weakness. Every week, he wrote a letter to his wife, his link to a sane world. In one letter, from October 1945, he wrote about the strange quiet of the camp. "We have Japs here, thin and quiet," he penned. "One of them strums that guitar like he is home on a porch. He plays their songs, I guess. It's a strange thing to hear, after everything we saw in New Guinea." The music began to slowly change the atmosphere of the camp. The silence between the prisoners and their guards, once thick with suspicion, began to thin. Some of the guards would hum along to the simpler tunes. A few of the Japanese prisoners, emboldened, would dare to request songs they remembered from their youth. Nakamura played them all, the simple folk melodies becoming the soundtrack to their strange, suspended lives. Yet as he played, as he saw the small smiles on the faces of his fellow prisoners and the quiet nods from the American guards, Nakamura knew a deep and unsettling truth. This peace, this fragile humanity, was a bubble. It existed only inside the tall wire fences of Camp McCoy. Winter arrived in Wisconsin with a silent, heavy blanket of white. By December 1945, snow was piled high against the barracks of Camp McCoy, muffling the sounds of the outside world and making the camp feel even more isolated. Inside, the air was warm from coal-burning stoves. It was in this strange, quiet world that the dissonance of Nakamura's captivity reached its peak. The American guards, preparing for their first peacetime Christmas in years, began to treat the prisoners with a kind of gentle curiosity. Nakamura was often asked to play the guitar, and his repertoire expanded. He learned the simple, hopeful melodies of Christmas hymns, the notes of Silent Night, echoing strangely through a room full of Japanese soldiers who had never known the story behind the song. During one particularly cold evening, Sergeant Harlan and another guard brought in a large thermos and shared hot cocoa with the prisoners gathered in the recreation hut. The men drank the sweet, warm liquid from tin cups, a gesture so profoundly at odds with the warrior code that some of the older Japanese soldiers could not bring themselves to accept it. They had been trained for glorious banzai charges, to die for the emperor with his name on their lips. They had not been trained for cocoa and Christmas carols. The most surreal moment came when the camp's Catholic chaplain, a kind-faced man with tired eyes, approached Nakamura. He asked, through a translator, if Nakamura would be willing to play the guitar during a small service. And so, on a Sunday morning, Prisoner No. 2738 sat in a makeshift chapel and played a soft, instrumental version of Ave Maria while American soldiers knelt and prayed. The melody floated through the room, a thread of pure sound connecting men who, just months earlier, had been trying to kill one another. Many of them, on both sides of the room, wept quietly into their hands. This careful, managed humanity was an island. The reality, for most Japanese prisoners of war in other parts of the world, was a nightmare. In the Soviet Union, the surrender of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria had delivered over 600,000 Japanese soldiers into Russian hands. They were not sent to camps with recreation huts and chaplains. They were shipped to the vast, frozen expanse of Siberia, where they were forced into hard labor in mines and lumber yards on starvation rations. Tens of thousands would never see Japan again, their bodies buried in unmarked graves in the frozen earth. The American system, by contrast, was built on a different philosophy. It was not just about fulfilling the obligations of the Geneva Convention, it was also a strategic choice. High-level policy dictated that POWs, especially from Germany and Japan, could be exposed to the principles of democracy through educational courses, farm training, and humane treatment. The idea was to send them home not as bitter enemies, but as men who had seen a different way of life, potential seeds of a new, non-militaristic society. It was a grand experiment in re-education, conducted within the confines of barbed wire. For Nakamura, it was simply a daily series of baffling contradictions: the warm cocoa against the cold snow, the sacred music played for his captors, the carefully rationed kindness in a world that had been consumed by hate. Repatriation began in late 1946. The news spread through the camp like a slow-moving wave, a mixture of joy and apprehension. The men would finally be going home. As they packed their few belongings, Nakamura knew he would have to leave the guitar behind. It was property of the US Army. a tool of the camp's unique environment. It did not belong to him. On his last day, he sat with it one final time, playing the old Osaka lullaby that had been his first song. He left it leaning against the wall in the empty recreation hut, a silent testament to the strange peace he had found there. The long journey home was the reverse of his arrival. The ship crossed the same vast ocean, but now Nakamura was heading back to a life he could no longer imagine. He landed in a country he barely recognized. Osaka was a sprawling ruin, a landscape of rubble and charred wood where his home had once stood. The sweet smell of cherry blossoms had been replaced by the permanent scent of ash. It was here, in the ruins of his own city, that he found the cruelty he had been spared in America. His father, he learned, had been killed during an American air raid the previous spring. His mother, a woman who had once been full of life, was now thin and reserved, her eyes holding a permanent sorrow. She welcomed him with tears, but her joy was shaded by a deep and abiding fear. The neighbors whispered when he walked by. "He is back," they would say, their voices low. He lived because he surrendered. The word was an accusation. To them, he was not a survivor. He was a disgrace. His mother begged him to never speak of his time as a prisoner. She hid his identity from relatives, creating a story of him being stranded on a remote island, a lie to protect the family from the shame. The propaganda had been right after all. Capture was a shame worse than death. The humiliation, however, did not come from his enemies. It came from his own people. His internal world fractured. He had received mercy from his enemies, and now he received silence from his own. He put away all thoughts of music, the memory of the guitar now tainted by this new, heavier burden. He began to question if the kindness he'd experienced was real at all, or if it was just a softer, more sophisticated form of humiliation, a comfort that was meant to be taken away the moment he stepped back into his real life. The years that followed were quiet ones. By 1952, Japan had regained its sovereignty with the Treaty of San Francisco, and the nation was consumed with the monumental task of rebuilding itself from the ashes. Nakamura Kenji became a part of that effort, a quiet schoolteacher in a newly built school in Osaka. He was a good teacher, patient and disciplined, respected by his students and fellow faculty. But he had built a wall around a part of himself. He never spoke of America. He never mentioned the war beyond the vague facts required by the history curriculum. And he never, ever touched a musical instrument. The part of him that knew chords and melodies was locked away, buried under 2 decades of carefully cultivated silence. Sometimes, when his students sang the new patriotic songs of a peaceful Japan, their young voices full of earnest hope, he would hear a phantom sound beneath their singing. It was the ghost of 6 steel strings, the memory of a wooden guitar played in a warm hut thousands of miles away. It was a sound that belonged to a life he was forbidden to claim as his own. He was a man living in 2 worlds, the public world of a respectable teacher, and the secret world of prisoner No. 2738, a ghost who had been given a song. Then, in 1965, something shifted. An informal reunion was organized for a small group of men who had been held at Camp McCoy. They were all in their 40s now, husbands and fathers and grandfathers, their faces lined with the worries of ordinary life. They met in a small community hall, drinking green tea and speaking in low, polite tones about their jobs and their children. The war was a presence in the room, a heavy silence they all navigated around. No one wanted to talk about the shame. No one wanted to admit to the kindness they had been shown. To do so would be to reopen a wound that had never properly healed. But then one man, a former private named Ito, pulled a worn black and white photograph from his wallet. He slid it across the table. It was a picture of a much younger Nakamura, taken in the Wisconsin sunlight. He was in his POW uniform, holding the American guitar, and on his face, faint but unmistakable, was a smile. For a long moment, the men just stared at the image. It was proof. It was a key to a locked room. Slowly, the stories began to emerge, not as admissions of shame, but as shared memories. One man recalled the taste of the thick bread served at every meal. Another remembered a guard who had shown him a picture of his daughter. They spoke of the warmth of the barracks in the winter, and the books they had read in the recreation hut. And then, they spoke of the return home, and they all told the same story. The averted eyes of neighbors, the whispers of traitor, the heavy, suffocating silence of their own families. In that small room, surrounded by his fellow ghosts, Nakamura realized he was not alone. His experience was not a strange dream, it was a shared history. The reunion broke something open in Nakamura. The wall he had built inside himself began to crumble. He returned to his school a changed man. A few weeks later, he walked into the school's small music room, a place he had always avoided. He picked up one of the simple guitars used to teach the children. His fingers, now stiff with age, found the old chords. The sound was rusty, uncertain, but it was there. He began to teach music to his students after school, not just the patriotic songs, but the old folk melodies, the lullabies, the simple tunes that spoke of home and heart. One day, a curious student asked him why he had suddenly decided to teach music. Nakamura looked at the young faces before him, and for the first time, he told them a piece of the truth. "Honor is not chains," he said softly. "Sometimes it is the gift of a song." He only spoke publicly about his experience once. It was in 1980, at a small gathering for local veterans. He was an old man by then, his hair white, his movements slow. He stood before the other men, his voice quiet, but steady, and he did not speak of battles or strategies. He spoke of a different kind of war, the one that is fought inside a man's soul. "The enemy I feared gave me a guitar," he told them, his words filling the silent room. "My own people gave me silence, but music kept me alive between them." He sat down, his testimony complete. The story was not about a soldier, but about a sound. It was the sound that had bridged the gap between enemies, the sound that had preserved his humanity when he thought it lost, and the sound that, decades later, finally led him home. In war we expect chains. What lasts is the sound of strings.